here they are. You start. Okay. So then I start here on the inferior portion of the brain, which is this, and just putting the tip of the scissors underneath the dura mater, doing a mid-sagittal incision. Be careful to not go deep, to not damage the internal structures of the brain. So now that I have done up the way up to here, the optic chiasma, which is that, I'm making a frontal incision and try to retract a little bit this membrane, which is very tough, as I mentioned before. Even when you're cutting it, you can hear the sound, and when you are removing it, you can hear the tearing of the membranes that hold these meninges. So then I continued here in the mid-sagittal line, or longitudinal fissure, I should say. And one of the indentations of the dura mater goes deep into the longitudinal fissure, forming a separation between the two hemispheres of the brain. So our brain is subdivided into hemispheres, the left and the right, that are connected by axons of the corpus callosum, and then some of the axons in the anterior commissures of the brain. Okay, so see, this is the dura mater, and when it comes here to the base of the brain, just be careful when you're separating it, because you can tear out some of these structures like the cranial nerves, so you have to kind of be careful. And I'm going to cut the excess. And try to see what we have of attachment in here. So I try to preserve the optic chiasma, the pituitary gland. And it's not easy because this membrane, this meninge, is so intrinsically embedded within these tissues, so it's going to take a while. So this is the hardest part of the removal of the meninges, the dura mater in this area. So I reach here into this part where we have the optic nerves, so cranial nerve number 2. So in here, what I did was like a horizontal or a transverse section, I should say, and then I'm trying to go underneath and separate it from the optic nerves. And the optic nerves, basically, they run, once they enter into the brain, they run between the retina and the optic chiasma, so they enter into the brain and they make this crossing that is called the optic chiasma. Okay, so it's going to be hard to remove from there. I was trying to slide the tip of the scissors underneath and then show you the optic chiasma, but it seems like it's hard, so I will show it to you once I do the mid-sagittal section, which I'm going to do right now. So again, so this is the right hemisphere of the brain, left frontal lobes, parietal, occipital, temporal, then this cerebellum, medulla, then medulla oblongata, and this is the pons, and here we have pituitary gland and optic chiasma still covered by the dura mater. And these nerves that you see here are the olfactory nerves. Specifically will be the olfactory bulb, which is a dilation of the optic nerve. Now I'm going to do this mid-sagittal section so we can see the internal structures of the brain. So you do this using the scalpel, going deep into the longitudinal fissure, going all the way down, and this is what you can see. So this is the internal portion of the parietal lobe. This is the internal portion of the frontal, internal portion of the occipital. And then this white structure that you see here is called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is made by the series of axons that runs between the right and the left hemisphere, and that help us to communicate the right and the left hemisphere so we can transfer information from one hemisphere into the other. Underneath this corpus callosum, we have this cavity on the left and the right hemisphere. This is called the lateral ventricles. The lateral ventricles hold cerebrospinal fluid. And then these ones communicate with the third ventricle, which is this one in here. And then the third ventricle communicates with the fourth ventricle, which is this one in here. Now, there is communication between the left and the right ventricles, which is called the Intraventricular Foramen. And then there is communication between the lateral ventricles and the third ventricle with the foramen of Monroe. And then we have this communication between the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle with the cerebral aqueduct. And in here, we can see this region that is called the hypothalamus. And then the thalamus. And then under the hypothalamus, we have the hypothalamus, which is here. And then hanging from the hypothalamus, we have this gland that it is called the pituitary gland. And in here, anterior to the pituitary gland, we have the optic chiasma, the crossing of optic nerve number 2. And then we have then just below the, or inferior to the hypothalamus, we have the brainstem, which is this, and then here we have the pons, the medulla oblongata, and then the spinal cord, and in here we have the midsection of the cerebellum. This white structure inside the cerebellum is called the arbor vitae, or tree of life. This is where the axons of the different nerves goes and provides information into the cerebellum so we can maintain the functions properly given by the cerebellum, which will be equilibrium and the maintenance of fine movements within our limbs or muscles, skeletal muscles. Now, in general, the structure of the brain will be made by these cerebral cortex, which is gray matter. That's where we have the neurons. And we have indentations that are called the gyri. And then we have sulcus, like this one, that it is located between the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe. This is the lateral sulcus, and then we have one between the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe that is called the central sulcus. So that's for the structures of the brain. Now for the spinal cord. So again, we have the meninges. So we have the dura mater, the arachnoid, and the pia mater. And then out of the lateral portion, which is this of the spinal cords, we have bundles of nerves. So these nerves are sensory and they are motor. Both of them, they merge and they form the spinal cords. We have 31 they form the spinal nerves. So out of the anterior and posterior root, or the ventral, dorsal, or sensory and motor, we form spinal nerves. We have 31 in our spinal cord. And then if you make a section out of this spinal cord, you will be able to see the structures. This internal structure that has like an H shape, this will be the gray matter. And then outside of this gray matter, we have the white matter. Through this white matter, we have axons that goes up and down the spinal cord to communicate with the brain and with the peripheral structures in our body. And then in here, in the gray matter, we have the bodies of the neurons. So anteriorly, in our spinal cord exits the ventral nerves, which are motor, and posteriorly enters the sensory nerves, which are what we call the dorsal nerves. And then there will be some interneurons in between that are located here within the gray matter that helps for some reflexes to happen between the sensory or the afferent branch of the reflex arc, and then we have the interneuron that makes a bridge between the afferent portion of the reflex arc and the efferent, which is the effector motor nerve that provides this functioning of the reflex arc. So now here we have another spinal cord, which it shows better the longer nerves emerging from the sides of the spinal cord. And this is all for this video.